Hello, and welcome to Let's Talk About Wargames, the podcast where we talk about wargames. I am Jack, and with me here today, as always, is Joe. Hi, Joe.
Hello.
Joe tells me he is suffering from heat stroke because it's in Canada, quite warm today.
30 degrees Celsius, which is not cool.
About 87-ish degrees for us Americans. Just so you know, because I had to look it up just now. I'm embarrassed a little bit, but at least it's not humid there. I don't know. What's the weather like in Canada? Dry? Is it dry?
It's a little humid today. It comes and
Oh, a
goes, I
little
guess, with
humid.
the wind.
Oh,
Depends where you are.
la-di-da, Mr. Little Humid.
Mm-hmm.
I live on the East Coast where it's all swamp. It's all swamp, all of it. And then
That
there's
sounds
Florida,
fun.
which is like swamp squared.
Never been,
Don't go to
and I
Florida.
don't think I want to.
No, don't go to Florida. You wouldn't want. You wouldn't want to. And what we're talking about today is it's gonna get one of us killed, I think. Uh,
Oh boy.
yeah, well, you know what we're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, the topic of discussion today is what is a war game, and well, it's it's divisive. It's a divisive topic, I think. Um, much like much like any organized religion, people have been killed over this discussion. There have been schisms. There's the Eastern Orthodox and the Western Orthodox ideals of what makes a war game, and we also have our own version of Mormons. It's a whole thing, you know. Um,
I always think that deciding whether something's a war game or not is a very personal choice, and is best done in communion between you and the war game in question.
well, we can't have an episode on this if the answer is just it's based on vibes.
Well, I mean, that could be my argument on this side of it, is that, yeah, I mean, call whatever you want, whatever you want. I mean,
Well,
I'm not going to, but I mean, you
I think
can.
there's wiggle room here. There's wiggle room. There's wiggle room. Yeah, I think that there's arguments that can be made, but I think that there are things that are clearly a war game and clearly not a war game. We've we talked before in an earlier episode about public perception of what wargaming is, and someone said that American football uh, is a war game, and I don't think so. I don't agree with this. What do you, Joe? Are you recanting that position? Are you saying that it's in the eye of the beholder that Mr. John Madden could call American football a war game, and you'd say like, yeah, sure, man.
Well, all right. So if someone did broach this with me and say that they were going to count American football as a war game, that's fine. They can say that. I
No,
don't
Joe.
agree.
No.
It comes down to, like, I mean, we have labels and names to try and make things easier to classify. But you're right. People get really bent out of shape about whether something's a war game or not. And I think, especially when you're getting into some of the discussions in the last couple of years about tabletop war games, or even um, the contest to develop a war game,
Yeah.
where the war game community was trying to reach out to, underrepresented
Yeah.
communities to
Groups.
get their ideas on wargaming, and, like, none of those were what would be traditionally defined as a war game, right?
I
But
think that, well, yes, but I think that there's the caveat of the wargaming sphere. Wargame applies to a broader group of things that are not just war games anymore. But that is why, if you go back to one of our early episodes, I think this was episode 6 or 7, Miss Morgan Gouillon-Ratti said that she likes to think of these as conflict simulation games, and I like that as a larger umbrella term other than war games, because everyone online has been talking about we love votes for women. I haven't played this game. I heard
oh
it's really
yeah,
good.
I actually
Everyone
have
is
that
saying
for review
votes for
for
women,
us.
and we really should play that. Why don't you review it or something? You're the board game guy.
I really should. It's literally on my shelf. It's in my next
Yeah,
to play pile.
Joe. Um, and everyone's been talking about this game, but the thing about it is that it is traditionally it's got all these war game mechanics to it, in the terms of like map control, the mechanics and everything of this nature. But it's not about war. It's about uh, the the suffragette movement in the early 1900s in America. Now, whether you consider that a sort of political war in itself is another question. But I would posit that, in essence, a war game needs to be about violent fighting. And as far as I'm aware, most of the violent fighting from suffragette movements was in the UK, where women were throwing bombs at like politicians and stuff like that. And even then, I think that's just an overbearing protest movement. Overbearing isn't the right word. That's just an extreme protest movement. I don't think that's a war.
Yeah, I don't know enough about the actual events on either side of the pond to know if anything like
There were more
armed
murders
conflict
in the
went
UK
down.
about it. There were there
But
were
I,
there
I
were murders in the UK. I respect that. The women were like killing people, and that's cool. It's
but I
cool
get
to
what you're
kill people who
saying
oppress
that
you.
you want like an armed conflict to be at the core, even if it's not mechanically, but thematically part of the game for it to be a war game, to have
I,
armed conflict as a significant component.
I think I think that perhaps the goal of this episode is, by the end of it, we need to have a definition.
Ooh, spicy.
And so that's why you're if you call it a war game, it's a war game. That's not going to fly here, Joe. Come on. It Wargaming isn't fluid. Words mean things. If we want to talk about fluidity, we could have an episode about gender theory or something like that. But we'd have to invite someone else on, because we, as two cis guys, can't talk about that.
No, I
So
don't even want to. No, we need
we
guests.
bonus episode, force two cis guys to talk about gender theory for an hour. Uh,
You want to, talking about getting us killed. We let's
what?
just find all the topics we can't talk about and comment on that.
But yes, so what I am positing right now is that a war game is a game featured specifically around war, that deals with the management of the war effort on some amount, whether that is you controlling a specific unit of men, whether that is you controlling the uh, operational level or strategic level. But I would say that once it becomes a once there are other elements added to it, once you start managing things such as economy or things of that nature, it starts to become perhaps what I would say not a war game. In this effect, I would say things like Hearts of Iron 4 are probably on the border of being a war game. I think you could argue that it is. I think that you could also argue that it isn't. Um, but something more like Civilization, where warfighting is an aspect of it, but it is not the primary focus, and that is not what you're only doing. I would say that that is definitively not a war game. What do you think? What do you think? Do you argue with this definition, Joe?
So right off the hop, what do you mean by war? Is that including like
We can talk
insurrections, rebellions,
violent
gang
conflicts.
violence?
I would say gang violence could be considered a war game in itself.
Sure. So, but what I'm saying is the way you defined, you included
Mhm.
a term which does have a definition,
War.
which yeah,
What is it
and
good
that
for?
can be complicating. Because and my go to when we're talking about questions like this of the stuff on the border is the counterinsurgency series published by GMT, the board games.
That's a really good example. I
Yeah,
think
because
point is go ahead.
yeah, I mean those games specifically involve those other aspects that you talked about right there. But they are still fundamentally about conflicting ideologies or conflicting factions. They sometimes they are a war, even if it's undeclared one, like the fire in the lake being the basically the entirety of the Vietnam conflict, or getting on to one of them's coming out soon about insurgency and politics in the Philippines in like the 70s and 80s. I still think that's a war game, but a major component of that is political maneuvering.
Well, the famous, what is it? Clausewitz, wars, politics by any other means, etc., etc., etc.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So that makes it
However,
difficult.
well, that's the thing, is that I would say that something even like Afghanistan 11 or Vietnam, what is it, 67? These games
Oh
that
yes, yep.
deal with war as a matter of insurgency, where it's not only just you going around and shooting guys, but you attempting to politically or by force win over the people, so that way you win the conflict. That's war. That is it's partially political, but isn't all war at least partially political?
Hmm.
In
And
some
that's what
manner,
makes
it
it.
is war itself is at least two groups of people trying to exert their will over the other group by some amount of force,
So
right?
then, is it a matter of scale? 'Cause you're talking about something like civilization, where war is a component for it, a significant component, I think, in most games, but not you know the primary or not the only way of making changes, because economic, trade, diplomacy is all part of it too. So does it
Yeah,
have to be something with like a definable, achievable objective?
well, I think it matters also about the amount of focus put on it because in Civ, you're also managing the culture, you're managing the religion of the people and trade and everything. So you're managing the civilization to an extent that it is not focused primarily on war as the center aspect. I think that that is what it is, like what the differentiating factor is because it is not solely focused on conflict as the armed violent conflict as the main point of the game.
Hmm.
Uh, and I think that's what it is, where the line is drawn. And that's why I pointed out Hearts of Iron 4 earlier, is because you do manage the economy to some aspect, but a lot of that in Hearts of Iron, I would argue, is a war game because all of the economy is pointed towards the war effort at the end of the day. It is a game about creating a total warfare kind of society. Whether the total war games are about war or a war game, also, I by my own definition, I would have to say that they are.
Hmm. So I think a
Whether
good
that makes
one
me
to,
happy is another thing, but you know,
like, if we're talking about 4X games, I think Warhammer
sure.
40K Gladius is a good one to bring
Gladius
into
is a war
this.
game. Yeah, it's only about war, exactly.
Yeah, there's no diplomacy, but there is economy, there is base building, there is exploration, there's every aspect of a 4X game. Technology development, it's just they cut out the diplomacy and you're constantly in a state of war with everyone else. So it's civilization with that one chunk cut out,
Well,
because
exactly.
you can play it pretty defensively, I wouldn't say passively. But some of the civs in Gladius have very strict expansionist rules, like Space Marines, you get one city, and any expanding you do is putting little forts around resources. And they're just little towers that do damage and prevent someone from capturing it until they destroy it. So it's, yeah, I think it's a war game, but I think that, we're stripping away or adding mechanics. It's a very narrow line to cross, right?
Well, it is a game solely focused on war.
So then it comes
It is
back
the primary
to
focus.
less the mechanics and more theme,
It's a
thematic focus.
combination. It's a combination of these factors, I would say. But also, I think also what is important to point out, I would say most first-person shooters are not war games. They are games about war, but they are not war
Hmm.
games because war game implies some amount of what is the word I'm thinking of here? Amount of simulation to them. You're simulating
Yeah,
things happening, and I would
that
say that maybe Arma could be considered a war game, but Call of Duty, I don't think so.
yeah,
What
that's
do you
a
think?
that gets me back to the scaling aspect of it. If we have to have some sort of operational, level in a game for it to be a war game, because yeah, we could just say, it needs to be strategic or tactical, right? In decision making and how it's laid out. But I mean, I guess maybe I'm getting ahead of myself when I want to think about the way I've had war games described to me before, where it
Well,
needs
you're
to
the doing the
be.
describing now.
Hmm?
You're doing the describing now, though.
Yeah, I mean, I've always chafed against what the old crowd described as a war game being, this purely military, purely simulationist strategic, tactical, operational level. Pick one. Um, Conflict simulation, right? Because I don't know. You're making me think a lot here after work.
Good. I'm glad I'm doing that.
Yeah,
Suffer. Make your brain move.
because I guess what do I call votes for women at war game? I think that's gonna be my
See,
conclusion here is gonna be, yeah. Well, where does that game fall on the spectrum for me?
in conflict simulation, which
Hmm.
encapsulates war games, but it is not itself a war game. That is what I'm going to say.
But then we get into conflict simulation, and does that so is Call of Duty a conflict simulation?
No,
So
I'm not
there's
elaborating on that one. Good luck.
there's but that means there's levels of what we see in wargaming that we can place into conflict simulation, but there's a limit on that as well.
Exactly. And I would say that here's an example of a game I would consider conflict simulation. I have
Hmm.
recently been playing a lot of the soccer XCOM game, Football Tactics and Glory. I call it that because it's a turn-based game where you control your guys on the soccer pitch. I'm going to keep calling it soccer. I don't care if you're mad at me for it, and
Right?
you control them, and they have abilities and stats weighed against other players, and so you can try to pass against an opponent, pass by an opponent, and they will have stat rolls against you and things of this nature to see if it succeeds. And there's a whole meta game of strategizing and building your team out.
Hmm.
And because of the layer of complexity to it, I would say that it is a conflict simulation game
So Blood Bowl.
because, huh? Blood
Blood
Bowl.
Bowl.
Blood Bowl is conflict simulation. You could call it a war game though. There's a lot of violence going on there.
Yeah. Is Blood Bowl a war game?
Well, they tackle people in Football Tactics and Glory. They sometimes will take someone down for injury for a few months. Is that a war game? Because now there's violence.
Uh-huh. That's
I
the
would say that
question.
Blood Bowl is not a war game. It's conflict simulation. I'm going to stick to my guns on this one. I have to have a concrete definition here, or else this episode has no point.
I mean, it's fun. So what about Rule the Waves? Is that a war
Rule of
game?
Waves is a war game. Yeah.
But
That's all about you managing your fleet, building it, and then using it to fight wars.
I mean, I've played a few games where those wars take forever to materialize, where the
Well, that
game would
doesn't
be
mean
mostly about posturing, fleet building, resource management, and less about the actual conflict.
posturing itself is an expression of force in a way,
Uh-huh.
and you're managing the military in this regard.
Mhm.
But I think that it requires the ability for it to escalate into armed conflict at the very least. Something like you're mentioning my football tactics and glory or votes for women. As far as I'm aware, neither side will suddenly pull out guns and start shooting at the other one. As far as I'm
Mm.
aware, I could be wrong. I don't know a ton about votes for women.
Yeah, I haven't played it yet, and that's my vanity too. And
if
we
you
will
if
put a
you
review.
hold the game down and you tell me, Jack, there's a whole part of this game where it turns out all of the women just declare war on men, then I'll go back on my position. I'll say, yeah, that's a war game. But I don't think unless that happens that we can say that that is a war game. Unless they start doing guerrilla warfare or something to men, which they should have done, in my opinion. But until they do that, I don't think we can call it a war game.
So then the coin games are because they
Coin
do
games are war game. Well, not all
include that
coin
component.
games are war games, but
Oh boy.
all coin games are conflict simulation games.
So what? I guess do you know enough about coin games to pick one that you think is not a war game?
I don't know many coin games, unfortunately. Off
Hmm.
the top of my head, I wouldn't be able to tell you. I remember Robotech, like
Yeah.
that, like that game, but that one is a war game. There is fighting happening on the board.
Yeah. You
Yeah,
definitely have units that are definitely fighting.
yes, 100%. Um, I don't know. You're the bigger board gamer than me, and I think that a lot of the distinction between conflict simulation and wargaming would come in the board gaming sphere because a lot of uh, digital games don't really skirt that line too much. I mean, I'm thinking of all of the like the war games I know on
Hmm.
PC, things like Field of Glory, Pike and Shot, things of this nature. It's like that's a war game. There's
Hmm.
no mistaking it. Grand Tactician, that's a war game. There's no mistaking it. There's not really much of a line for a lot of the big popular games on PC into being, is this a war game or a conflict simulation? I would think that's more of a
So
board game thing.
what you're going for
Hmm.
is a game that is thematically tied to an armed conflict
Yes,
and mechanically involving managing some aspects of that conflict, including the actual act of warfighting at
correct,
either the tactical, operational, or strategic levels.
correct.
That seems pretty good to me.
Well, on this note, I'm now going to submit a game on PC that might be a little bit controversial for me to say is a war game.
Yeah.
I am going to say that Empire of Sin, Paradox's uh, XCOM-like gang management simulator, where you play a gangster in 20s Chicago and just have to try to take over neighborhoods and open up speakeasies and whatnot and fight other gangs.
Hmm.
I would say that is a war game.
Yeah, I would have no problem with that.
You're not even going to argue with me on this.
No,
Someone
I
is
think that's fine.
screaming at their podcast recording at their podcast listening app right now. They're like, "Jack, you fool!
No, no, no,
That
no.
is not a
That's
war game."
fine. You literally have thematically, you're talking about gang wars, and you're talking about in the extremist sense, insurrection against the state because you have a competing
You could also fight cops, yeah.
organization, and you are controlling the economy, you're controlling territorial expansion, and then you do go down to the XCOM level and fight tactical battles. I
Yep.
don't see how you could say that's not a war game.
Well, I think the argument would come because they're not technically waging a war.
But that rules
Technically.
out every insurrection, and
Well,
that's
I
not okay.
agree, but that's why I'm saying that it is, and I'm
Yeah,
saying that some people probably are arguing with me, but no, I'm just strawmanning right now because you're agreeing with me. You're being too agreeable. Argue with me, Joe. Tell me something that's a war game. What's a war game, Joe?
Partisans 1941.
Wrong. Yes, it is. I'm not going to argue with that one. Yeah, yeah,
See,
that's
now
a war
that
game.
one, it's so small scale though. Like, I guess it is, but you're
Well,
literally
what it is,
controlling like a 5 people
you're
doing.
managing a guerrilla warfare band. They're doing guerrilla warfare.
Yeah,
That's war.
but
Are you
is
saying
it?
that guerrilla warfare isn't war?
No, I'm wondering about
Joe,
the scale aspect that I keep bringing up
I would say that
because
Arma is a war game because because there's an attention to detail level that is required, I think, for it to be a war game.
back to the
Uh,
simulation aspect.
Back to the simulation aspect, right? And Partisans simulates heavily things like stealth, things like ammo management, food management, medical supplies management, things of that nature.
So it seems like there's
Um,
3 or 4 different avenues that a game can take to be classified as a war game for you.
yes, and I think that there needs to be an element of simulation in there, and that is what separates things like Call of Duty and Battlefield and things like that from being war games.
So
Now, is Enlisted a war game, though, is the question.
yeah, I was gonna say stuff like Enlisted, or even going back to Gladius, where
Gladius is a war game.
simulation's a little rough. I don't know. I mean, you're
I would say it's
everyone's
also,
got magic powers. There's no
well, I mean, it's
supply
kind of on the border.
issues.
Well, that's the thing, though, is that it does, well, things like Age of Wonders, is that the name of the game? Yeah, Age of Wonders 4 just came out.
Hmm.
I'm working on a review for that. I would say that's a war game. And that's got
Ugh.
magic powers and whatnot. People shoot fireballs or whatever.
So I feel like I have a
But
trouble with that one more. That seems more along the line of Master of Magic, where it's a 4X game that just happens to have war.
well, it's a 4X game,
Hmm.
but the primary focus of this game is warfare.
Okay.
There are pacifist methods, but it's just like trying to be. If you're playing pacifist, you're ignoring fully like 3/4 of the game. And I think that that is what the primary focus of the game is on warfighting. If you have like 66% of the game or something like that is about conducting war, then I would say that that is a war game. That is what I would say the amount of focus needs to be.
So
66%.
you have to have 60% warfare. There has to be simulationist elements. Oh,
Yes.
sorry. Or these are or conditions, right? It has to be
Or
66% warfare, or
or
simulation of
hmm
warfare, or um, what was the third one? Thematically involving war.
well, thematically, I don't know. What do you mean by thematically in this case?
I mean, like if a game is about a war.
if a game is about a war, that could be any Call of Duty again, though. I want to specifically exclude things like Call of Duty from being called war games because I would say that they're definitely not.
Hmm.
Just an FPS shooter where you just run around and shoot guys. I would not say that as a war game.
Oh boy. Okay, so what about
I
like
would say
Call
that
to Arms?
maybe let me go back on this a little bit. Maybe Call of the early Call of Duty games, where they were slower paced and more tactical focused, those could perhaps be considered war games. Call of Duty like one.
Okay, so what this is getting into, can games of a genre fulfill the requirements to be listed as a war game?
I think any game genre can be a war game. You could have a rhythm based war game if it was about like press the spacebar on the beat to blow up people or something.
Really?
Maybe if there's other aspects to it, yeah. If there's other elements to it, if there's a lot of simulation going on behind the background. I'm not saying that one exists. I'm saying one theoretically could exist.
Hmm. Okay. Okay. All right. That might be a stretch for me, I guess. So like, what
I'm
if
just
you got a rhythm-based game where you're a
yeah.
ancient era drummer keeping time to get your troops
Yeah,
moving in
it's
order?
your Patapon is a war game. That is the stance I'm taking. Patapon is a war game.
Okay.
I had forgotten that it existed, and you just reminded me.
Wow.
Patapon is
There
a
we go.
war game.
And that's where we lost our audience entirely.
No, everyone's agreeing with me. They all put their phones down and they're clapping and saluting at me.
Um,
Everyone agrees. Patapon's a war game.
is it available anywhere other than PSP?
It's actually on PlayStation. I picked up one and
Oh,
two on PlayStation.
how
Yeah.
about you tell people what Patapon is so they can go and experience this
Patapon
excellent
rules.
simulation?
Patapon is you're basically these little weird dudes god, and in order to and you control them on these missions where it's a side-scrolling screen, and they're all on the screen, and you give them orders via rhythm-based drum beats to either advance, attack, defend themselves, or retreat. And the entire game is just based on you giving orders via different drum beats to tell them what to do. And you can also, through the course of these missions, you unlock things and get resources to change up your army and things like this. And all I'm saying is that Patapon is a war game. I'm not.
No, I'm
I
looking
will
at
fight
screens
about this
again
one.
and
Hmm?
remembering it. Yeah, pretty much. I mean, like, sure.
The
Even the
problem is
cover is a
though is
bunch of
that
guys with bows
I'm
and
not very
swords.
good. I'm not very good at staying on beat in Patapon, so I'm not very good. I was never a drummer. I was in chorus. Leave me alone. Now, if
So
there was a singing based war game, I might be more okay.
I'm sure someone could come up with that. There's that
Yeah,
heavy metal rhythm-based shooter that came out recently.
yeah. I don't
So,
remember the name of it.
eh.
I remember hearing reviews said it was okay, so I kind of ignored it. I'm a jazz guy. What do you want from me?
All right, so getting back to it, it seems like what you're going for works for most people's understanding of war games, and that it needs to fulfill a few requirements to cross over
Two of the
and
three. Let's
become
say two of those three.
two of those three. To be moved from conflict simulation game, which is anything involving conflict, which is Super Mario Rescuing Peach, even,
I
to
think that that's a little broad. I wouldn't call Mario Rescuing Peach conflict simulation. I would
oh,
say
it's a
that there needs to
conflict and
be
we're
a
simulating it.
oh, we have to have a different episode talking about what is a conflict simulation game. But I think that's a little bit broad. But yeah, war game. It has to be primarily focused on war. There has to be a level of attention to detail focused on the granular aspects of war fighting. Or the third point that you had made, and I don't remember what that was.
um, yeah, someone will figure it out.
It has to fulfill two of the three conditions we can't remember
Yep,
in
that's how we
order
know
to
how
be a war
invested we
game.
are in these conditions.
Uh,
So,
it's 5:30 on a Friday, man. I'm thinking about going to I'm not gonna go party tonight. Who am I kidding? I'm thinking about dinner. That's what I'm thinking about.
so
Is cooking a war game? Could we have a cooking war game? You
if there's
could
two
actually,
opposing
if you're it's
sides,
about doing managing a mess hall or something like that during a conflict,
managing a
perhaps.
mess hall where you also have a mini game where you're doing cooking mama.
Cooking Mama goes to war.
There you go.
Cooking Mama in Vietnam. Um, there is actually another game that came out recently, and this is, I think, the one that I want to talk to you about. I don't remember the name of it, but I saw it on Steam. It came up. It's about you manage a military training camp,
Oh yeah, I think
and
that's by the same guy who did the airplane game you didn't quite like.
yeah, I didn't like that one. This one looked a little bit more promising, but I don't recall the name of it. I'm sorry about
Well,
that.
there's actually two of them, right? Because there was a 3D one that's more like your.
One military camp is the name of this game.
Is that the one that's like the Sim Hospital?
Kind of looks like Sim Hospital. It's got a kind of a
Ah,
cartoony look about it.
yeah. So there's this one, which is the Sim Hospital looking one, and then there's the other one that's 8-bit style graphics by the same guy who did the airplane one.
Oh,
So there's actually
well, there's
two
two of these then. I would say
military
that
camp
this is
games.
a war game,
Ugh, but you
kind
don't
of.
do any warring.
Well,
You
you
can be
train
entirely
for
in
war.
peacetime.
Well, you direct people to go do war, though. You manage them.
The
You
war is
you train the
ongoing
troops.
while you're training them.
That's what the one military camp game does. Like you train the guys, and then you go send them to do battles off screen based on how you've trained them and stuff.
What a
I'm
brutal
not sure
concept
about
for
the
a game.
other game that you're talking about.
Where you're just like, hey guys, it was great training you. Good luck. And then like
Yeah,
5 minutes
you
later, you get a
immediately
report.
send them into a meat a wood chipper over there, the meat grinder.
Yeah, you're like, oh, that was a good class. Well, they're 90% casualty rate. Okay, cool.
it's it's just Pink Floyd's The Wall, but the game.
Oh god. So okay, I don't know that. Don't think I'd like to call that one a war game.
I'll
It's
do it. I
war
don't care.
adjacent. How is it
I
that
was
we started this with me having less of a strict thing here, and now I'm not agreeing with
I have
what
this
you're
effect on
classifying?
people. I have this effect on people. Now
Come
you're poo-pooing me. You're saying, "No, Jack, that can't be a war game." What about
Oh,
Madden? Let's go back to Madden. Is Madden a war game? Is NFL a war game? Football? American football? Is that a war game?
sports? Sports are
Yeah.
supposed to be conflict simulation.
No, Joe. No.
That's what they are. It's less lethal conflict.
They're not doing this as a matter of solving. Okay, you know what? Actually, I'll recant this a little bit. Well, American football is not European football, where the teams have where the team fan bases have political alignments to them, like how there's like uh, right wing soccer teams and then left wing soccer teams and whatnot, and then like Scottish nationalist soccer teams or whatever. That could be a conflict simulation. I'll say that
Well,
could be.
I mean, sports by their nature is two opposing teams with a tactical goal to achieve that are using tactics and their resources of manpower, to achieve their goals. It's literally war, just people are kicking a ball around instead of shooting each other.
Maybe they should be. Give them paintball guns.
That would be, I think we have paintball for that.
No, paintball football. Shoot each other with paintball guns while playing football.
I mean, football actually, you literally have a front line that moves in football.
Well, then you dig trenches in the football field and move up and down. And no, is this
Yeah,
nothing? I think I'm onto something here. I think this could be a good game.
I'd rather just see more Blood Bowl, which I'm pretty sure is just rugby.
Well, maybe you don't want to see more Blood Bowl. I heard Blood Bowl 3 isn't good.
Oh, that's too bad.
Really, just I think that the thing with this one is just a lot of in-game shop stuff, which I'm not a fan of. Every
No,
game's doing it now, and I hate it.
definitely don't want that. I don't know. I
It's
think back to the original thesis here that no, I probably wouldn't call Votes Room a war game. I would call it a conflict simulation game. But I also probably wouldn't call that camp game a war game, nor would I call 4X's war games.
what about Metal Gear Solid 5?
I haven't played it. Is
You
there?
manage immersive. You run around in Soviet Afghanistan and in PMC area in Africa, and you fight people and you do a whole Metal Gear Solid plot line. But at the same time, you're managing a mercenary base that you send out on missions to go do things. You don't personally control them, but you send them out to do war and things like that. And you are
Oh,
also personally fighting guys on the ground.
I don't know if
Is Metal Gear Solid
management.
5 a war game, Joe?
I don't think management is a key factor in deciding whether something's a war game. Can't you do
I
that in like
agree. I
Assassin's
agree.
Creed
I just
2?
wanted to see what you would say. If you
I remember
disagree with me,
Assassin's
I was gonna
Creed, you
get
can
you.
do that, right? You can just start, you like get assassins and then send them to do shit.
And then they go Creed people. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean that like no, it's not a war game.
No.
So I mean, if you're looking at like old school definitions, they're pretty simple, right?
Is Dungeons and Dragons a war game?
It used to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Used to be is the answer.
Wargame is a strategy game in which two or more players command opposing armed forces in a realistic simulation of an armed conflict.
What about Dawn of War 3, Joe?
I mean,
You
I
said you were
think
gonna pick that up. Did you end up playing it?
I picked it up and I played the tutorials.
Is it a war game?
Sure.
No, you're wrong. Wrong.
How is that wrong?
Wrong.
That literally
It's a
fulfills all
MOBA.
three of your definitions.
It's a MOBA.
You have it's thematically about a
If
war.
it's a MOBA, everything else is moot.
You are literally organizing and managing forces, and then you are commanding those forces tactically on the battlefield. It cannot be more war game by your definition. Just because
Well,
it
it's not a war game
sucks.
because I don't like it.
It doesn't mean it doesn't fit.
Yes, it
Here's a
does.
fun one. Easy Red 2.
Easy Red 2, what's that?
It is a like $5 battlefield like, but you command your little squads.
You command a squad?
You command whatever squad you're currently in. You can call an artillery support, you can get special weapons and whatnot,
Like
and then you're
it
running
sounds
around and
like
capturing
Enlisted.
flags. Yeah, it's basically like Enlisted, only it's mostly single player, and it's $5.
We said Enlisted was a war game,
I
right?
think we were going to come back to that one
Yeah,
because
Enlisted is a war
it's
game. Screw it. Yeah,
because
I'll
you're
call it a war game. Whatever.
fighting because you have a squad.
Well, it's there's an intention to detail there. It is less, I shall say, unrealistic than things like Call of Duty and Battlefield. It is not realistic, but there is a level of granularity there. Um, Particularly with things like vehicle management and everything. Uh,
Mm,
you know, that's is that nothing? Do you not agree with that?
I don't know, because then I think you could just say Battlefield 5 is the same thing. You just have a squad of other players who don't listen to you.
I don't think so.
So you need to have the AI component, or it needs to be ticked up in the level of realism or the simulation aspect.
There needs to be a realistic aspect to it. I think that well that's with things like Dawn of War or um, your Warhammer games and stuff are war games, even though they're not operating by our terms of realism because they have their own set terms of realism and everything.
Now you're getting dangerous.
But that's the thing with something like Call of Duty. It's supposed to be operating in our world, but there are guys with like jetpacks and stuff now, and you takes like 30 shots from a gun to kill someone and things like that.
So because they're operating on a fantastical version of reality, they don't get to
Yeah,
qualify. But if it's
it
fantastical
is.
version of fantasy, it does qualify.
If it is operating realistically according to the in-game universe. If
Aha,
it
but
takes
Call of
place in
Duty
our
is.
world, huh?
Because its own in-game universe is wacky as shit. Just
No, it
because
takes place in our
it's,
world.
I mean, it's set in our world, but it is definitely a wacky, crazy spy fiction James Bond-esque craziness.
I think you're crazy. I don't agree.
I think you're trying to. So that means if something is at all placed on planet Earth in a time between now and the past, and it has any
Hmm.
fantastical elements, it can't be a war game.
Yeah,
Well, I think Total War Troy is a war game.
I think the realism mode in Total War Troy is a war game where they have the generals with their units and everything. Just like I think that the records mode for Total War Three Kingdoms is because they have realism. But when you have Guan Yu out there killing 3,000 enemy soldiers just because he's a Chad, I don't think that's a war game.
But it's about war. You've got the strategic.
But it's not operating by the constraints of real life, though.
It's operating by its own constraints. You're managing resources. You're
It's in
managing supplies
our
and
world,
logistics.
Joseph.
I don't think you're subscribing to your own rules here.
This is my rules. I'm adding this as a rule. It has to follow the constraints of the universe that it is set in.
Okay, I think you're being too narrow in
I don't
setting the
think
universe,
so.
because
I
the
don't
universe
think
of
so.
Romance of the Three Kingdoms is special. In that
I'm in
universe,
that
that happens.
universe. I'm not special.
In the story, these things happened. The story isn't saying that this is made up. The story is saying this is real, and that's the story the game tape takes place in. So it's as real as Warhammer Fantasy is. Because in the story of the Three Kingdoms, Lu Bu does go and kill 3,000 people, whatever the hell he does. In Troy, there really are gods, making the river get up and slap Achilles in the ass.
But consider that I don't like that.
Okay. And that's why we
I
get back
don't.
to my original point of you can believe whatever you want.
Well, no, people have to believe what I believe because I have a podcast. And so do you, I guess, so they can believe you too.
Yep.
But
I think we just came wonderfully full circle, don't you?
congratulations, everyone. You've wasted 41 minutes.
No, I don't think they did. I think it's a fun thing to look at, and I think it's important to do what we do sometimes and talk about the semantics of the thing we get into, because this is, we just had this 45-minute talk, but there is millions of pages of spilled ink over, you know, people yelling at each other saying that they can't enjoy the thing that they're enjoying and call it X because it doesn't fulfill whatever random requirement they have. I don't think that's beneficial for war games in the broad sense because, we want people to be included, right?
Yeah, I want people to be included. I didn't say they have the people who can play war games. I'm talking about what are war games. That's the difference.
Hmm. And I
Yeah,
think Total War Three Kingdoms is fine.
I'm
I
gonna
think that
get.
was a fun one. I think people will like that. Right, people? You can comment and tell me how wrong I am. Or comment and tell me how right I am. But as long as you
I'm
comment.
gonna dox you, Joe.
Don't you already know where I live?
Yeah, exactly. I'm not saying about doxing you to me. I know where you live. I'll tell everyone else where you live. They can send you letters about how wrong you are.
Send war games. Which
Send
means
conflict simulation
send
games.
whatever you want to send. uh, well, I think that was fun.
Yeah, it was a good spot to wrap up.
Mm-hmm.
This is a shorter episode because we're recording on a Friday night, and both of us have things we need to go be doing.
Yep.
Um, but we will have more things coming your way, potentially streaming soon. Um,
Reviews.
health and time willing.
Got
Reviews, yeah.
votes for women on my shelf that I really need to play because they sent that to me, and I appreciate Four Circle Games. They were really great with the last one they sent, and I want to give them the due.
I put out a review on Second Front earlier this week. It's a good game,
Ah,
and
you
if you
came
want to read the
around.
review, I also say that there.
That you
Um,
like it, or that it's a war game.
it's both.
Mm-hmm.
I would say Second Front's a word. We're not having this argument again.
I'm glad you liked it. I really
Bad
enjoyed that
Joe.
game.
Okay, yeah, I did. On that note, I think that's everything from both of us. You follow Joe at
Nah, don't worry about
Joe
it.
Fonseca Hist on Twitter. You don't follow Joe.
I haven't been on
You
Twitter in months, and I'm probably not going to come back.
unfollow Joe on
Yeah,
Twitter.
I
You
appreciate
can
the time
follow
you
me.
were with me. Come to the Discord, hang out there.
Yeah,
That's way more
come
fun.
to the Discord. Come to the Discord, hang out. We should do King of the Castle. Stream King of the Castle sometime. You familiar with that?
No.
It is like Jackbox, kind of where one player has the game, and everyone else can tune in on their phones. And the idea of King of the Castle is that the player who is hosting the game is the king of this kingdom, and everyone else is in one of three groups of nobles that are all trying to overthrow the king. And it's all based around the king making decisions, and the nobles voting on them. And everyone has goals set against each other. It's a lot of fun.
That does sound like fun. Come join
It is.
the Discord and play that with us.
Yeah, play that with us. Anyway, that is it from us. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in and listening to us, and we hope to see you in the Discord and be talking at you again soon. Thank you, and
Thanks,
have a
everybody.
good one.
Have a good one.
Wiedersehen.